Sophie Bennett adjusted the coral bikini for the third time, tugging nervously at the strap as she studied herself in the mirror. Her small Brookline apartment smelled faintly of coffee, and the vanilla spray she always misted across the couch cushions. Outside, the quiet Massachusetts street was alive with April's promise. Fresh lilacs blooming, spring air drifting through the open windows, carrying a sweetness that made the whole room feel lighter. She inhaled deeply, lifted her phone and angled it carefully. The golden afternoon light filtered through the curtains, softening the edges of her reflection. One quick photo, playful, daring, a little more confident than she usually felt. This one was meant for Olivia Price, her best friend since college. Sophie typed quickly. Worth it for Cape Cod this summer? Without a second thought, she tapped the first Olivia in her contacts and hit send. The familiar whoosh of iMessage sealed it. She tossed the phone onto the bed with a relieved laugh, padding into the kitchen to make a snack. It wasn't often she felt this bold. After the last few turbulent months at work, this moment of easy self-confidence felt like a small victory. 10 minutes later, her phone buzzed. Smiling, Sophie rushed back to the bedroom, eager for Olivia's teasing approval. But when she glanced at the screen, her heart stuttered. Alexander Harrington, CEO. I believe this was sent to me in error. Please be more careful with future communications. Have a good weekend, Sophie. Her blood ran cold. Alexander Harrington, her boss. 35. Impossibly composed and already legendary in Boston's financial district for transforming Harrington Consulting into one of the city's most formidable firms. 6'2", surgical in his suits, cool gray eyes that could dismantle anyone in a single boardroom glance. The man she'd spoken to directly only a handful of times since joining as his assistant 3 weeks ago, had just received her bikini photo. Sophie collapsed onto the couch, cushions rough against her skin. No, 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 she whispered, scrolling desperately through the conversation thread. But there it was, undeniable. Her message, her photo, sitting right in his inbox. Her stomach twisted painfully. She had always been careful, meticulous about details, and yet she'd made the most humiliating mistake of her career. Her cheeks flamed, her hands trembling as she reread his reply. Formal, professional, exactly what she'd expect, and yet something about it snagged at her. I believe, a phrase that felt softer, less condemning than it could have been. Almost gentle, almost curious. Mortification clamped down on her chest, hot and suffocating. But under the shame flickered something more dangerous, something she didn't want to admit, a spark that felt like the start of a storm. Monday dawned gray and restless, though Sophie had been awake long before the sun. Sleep had been a stranger all weekend. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw that message from Alexander Harrington and relived the whoosh of her mistake. By the time her alarm rang, her nerves were already frayed. She chose her outfit with painstaking care. A navy blazer pressed sharp at the shoulders, a cream blouse buttoned neatly to her collarbone, and heels polished to a shine. If she couldn't erase the humiliation, at least she could mask it with professionalism. Her makeup was understated, her hair smoothed into place, but the mirror still reflected the anxiety she couldn't disguise. The marble lobby of Harrington Tower gleamed as she stepped inside, her heels clicking softly against the polished floor. The smell of fresh espresso wafted from the cafe near reception, but it only made her stomach twist tighter. She spotted Olivia Price at the desk, cheerfully sorting through the morning deliveries. "Good morning, Sophie," Olivia called brightly. Then she frowned. "You look pale. Everything okay?" "I'm fine," Sophie lied quickly, forcing a smile that felt brittle. Her throat tightened as she walked toward her desk. The entire floor buzzed with its usual Monday energy, phones ringing, keyboards clattering. But all Sophie could think about was whether Alexander Harrington would look at her differently now. Whether he would even acknowledge her at all. She didn't have to wonder long. "Sophie?" His voice was low, smooth, impossible to ignore. She turned, pulse hammering, and there he was. Alexander Harrington, composed as ever in a charcoal suit, his tie a precise Windsor knot. He stood beside her desk, the faintest trace of his cologne curling through the air. He set a folder down gently, his fingers brushing hers for the briefest second, enough to send a sharp current through her veins. "These are the contracts for the Peterson meeting at 10, he said. "Yes." "Mr. Harrington," Sophie managed, her voice higher than she intended. For a heartbeat, the corner of his mouth shifted, almost a smile. He leaned closer, speaking softly enough that only she could hear. Next time you're sending photos to friends, double-check the recipient. Her entire face burned. Don't apologize, Alexander interrupted, his tone perfectly calm. But his eyes lingered on hers, gray and steady, carrying something she couldn't name. It was enlightening. And just like that, he straightened, collected, and walked away with the effortless stride of a man used to owning every room he entered. Sophie sat frozen in her chair, fingers pressed tight around the folder he'd left behind. Her heart pounded and her breath refused to steady. She should have been relieved that he hadn't fired her, hadn't reprimanded her in front of the staff. But instead his words echoed in her mind, twisting embarrassment into something far more confusing. Enlightening. What had he meant, and why, despite everything, did it make her pulse race? By lunchtime, Sophie's nerves were raw. Every time she glanced up from her desk, she felt it. That weight of gray eyes from behind the glass walls of Alexander Harrington's office. He never lingered long enough to be obvious, but she knew. She felt it, and every time their gazes nearly met, her chest tightened. By noon, she couldn't take it anymore. She grabbed her tablet, forced a professional expression, and headed to the cafeteria. The room buzzed with chatter and clinking cutlery, a steady rhythm that usually calmed her. Today it only half worked. She settled near the windows, poking at a Caesar salad while pretending to scroll through a report. Her thoughts swirled, his voice in her ear that morning. The careful way he'd said enlightening. What did he mean? Why did it feel like a secret meant only for her? Excuse me, a cheerful voice broke through her spiral. Is this seat taken? Sophie looked up. A tall young man with sandy blonde hair and bright green eyes smiled at her. He couldn't have been more than 25, dressed neatly in a light blue shirt that looked fresh off the rack. There was something refreshingly easy about him, a lightness she hadn't felt all morning. She shook her head, grateful for the interruption. No, go ahead. He slid into the seat and offered his hand. Liam Brooks. I just started yesterday, marketing intern. Sophie smiled politely as they shook hands. Sophie Bennett. Welcome to Harrington Consulting. So you're the famous Sophie, Liam teased, his grin widening. Word around here is you keep this place running while surviving Mr. Harrington's impossible schedule. Her cheeks flushed slightly. Famous? I hope it's for professional reasons. Of course, Liam said, though his tone carried a spark of mischief. Must be a challenge, though. He's demanding, right? Sophie hesitated, twirling her fork through the lettuce. He's very focused, but fair. Before Liam could respond, the air shifted. Sophie didn't even need to turn to know who it was. Her pulse spiked just from the energy in the room. Slowly, she looked up. Alexander Harrington stood a few feet away, lunch tray in hand, his expression as composed as ever. But his eyes weren't on his food. They were fixed squarely on Liam. Mr. Harrington, Sophie said quickly, her voice rising in pitch. This is Liam Brooks, the new marketing intern. Liam jumped to his feet, extending his hand enthusiastically. It's an honor to meet you, sir. I'm excited to be here. Alexander regarded him coolly, his eyes flicking to the outstretched hand before accepting it briefly. Welcome, Brooks. We expect high standards. His tone was clipped, professional, but Sophie caught the undercurrent, ice edged with something sharper. He turned to her, gaze steady, unblinking. Sophie, please review the Peterson and Mills contracts before 2. Yes, Mr. Harrington, she replied quickly. He walked away, his stride calm and measured, but Sophie felt the heat he left in his wake. The room suddenly seemed smaller, heavier, the charged silence pressing against her ribs. Liam dropped back into his seat with an easy grin. Wow, he's intense. He leaned closer. So how about coffee sometime? Sophie laughed lightly, but her mind wasn't on Liam. Even across the cafeteria, through glass and distance, she could feel Alexander Harrington's presence like static electricity. No matter how far away he stood, it was as if he was right there, watching. That Friday afternoon, Sophie thought she might finally have a quiet hour to breathe. The Peterson contracts were filed. Her inbox was momentarily calm, and the hum of the office had settled into a steady rhythm. She had just sipped her coffee when Alexander Harrington's voice cut across her desk. Sophie, come with me. Her pulse stumbled. She grabbed her notepad and hurried to follow him, her heels clicking against the marble floor as they stepped into the elevator together. "Where are we going?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "Archives," he replied, pressing the button marked B12. His tone gave nothing away, though his posture, hands clasped behind his back, gaze fixed forward, was taut with control. The elevator lurched downward. Sophie's throat went dry in the silence, aware of the confined space, of how close he stood. She could feel his presence as though it radiated heat. Finally he spoke. "Brooks seems enthusiastic. It wasn't a question." Sophie blinked. "Liam, yes, he's eager to make a good impression." Alexander's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Enthusiasm doesn't always equate to capability. The elevator doors opened before she could respond. The basement corridors smelled faintly of paper and dust, lined with fluorescent lights that hummed overhead. He led her to the heavy metal door of B12 and swiped his keycard. The lock clicked, and they stepped into the cool, dim expanse of the archive room. Rows upon rows of shelves stretched into the distance, stacked with files and boxes. Sophie trailed after him, hugging her notepad to her chest. "Pull the Whitman accounts from 2016, he instructed, gesturing toward a tall cabinet. She obeyed quickly, stretching onto her toes to tug at the heavy binders. One slipped, nearly toppling from the shelf, but Alexander's hand shot out, steadying it and her wrist at once. The touch burned through her skin. Their eyes met, and the world seemed to narrow until it was just the two of them, suspended in that charged moment. "Sophie," he said quietly, his voice lower than she'd ever heard it.
"That photo!"
Her breath caught. I replayed it in my mind more times than I should admit. His gaze was unwavering, fierce and unguarded. It wasn't just enlightening. It was unforgettable. Her heart thudded against her ribs. She should look away, should retreat, but instead the truth slipped out in a whisper. Maybe it wasn't a mistake. His eyes darkened, a dangerous flicker of something between restraint and desire. For a heartbeat, Sophie thought he might close the distance between them right there in the archives. But the heavy creak of the door broke the spell. Mr. O'Leary, the elderly security guard, stepped in with a puzzled glance.
"Everything all right down here?"
Alexander released her wrist instantly, his face returning to cool composure. "Just retrieving files." "Thank you." Sophie clutched the binder to her chest, cheeks blazing. The moment was gone, but its weight lingered, thrumming in her veins as they walked back toward the elevator in silence. The Fairmont Copley Plaza glowed with golden chandeliers and soft music, its ballroom filled with Boston's sharpest suits and glittering gowns. Sophie Bennett smoothed the satin of her midnight blue dress, her pulse skipping as she stepped inside. This was her first major company gala since joining Harrington Consulting, and the sheer scale of it dazzled her. Crystal glasses clinking, laughter echoing under vaulted ceilings, conversations buzzing about deals and markets. She adjusted her clutch nervously. She was here as Alexander Harrington's assistant, yes, but also as part of the company's public face tonight. Every detail mattered. Her posture, her smile, the way she carried herself. Then she saw him. Alexander stood across the room, tall and commanding in a black tuxedo cut to perfection. His presence eclipsed the crowd, gray eyes scanning the ballroom with quiet authority. Sophie's breath hitched. He looked like he belonged to another world, untouchable, magnetic. Their gazes met for the briefest moment. Something flickered there. Recognition, maybe more. But before she could linger, a new voice greeted her. "Sophie Bennett, right?" She turned to see Christopher Vaughn, the firm's New York director, extending a confident smile. His dark hair was slicked back, his navy suit impeccable. He radiated charm, the kind that was practiced and deliberate. "Yes," Sophie said politely, shaking his hand. "I've heard a lot about you," Christopher said smoothly. "Alexander keeps his best talent close. Seems he was smart too." Heat rushed to her cheeks. She opened her mouth to respond, but Christopher leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "If Boston ever feels too small, New York could use someone with your skill." Before Sophie could answer, Alexander appeared at her side. His presence was a wall of quiet power. "Vaughn," he said evenly, though his tone carried steel. "I see you've met Sophie." Christopher smiled unfazed. "We were just discussing opportunities." "Opportunities," Alexander repeated, his eyes narrowing slightly. He turned to Sophie, his expression softening for a fraction of a second. "Would you excuse us, Sophie? I'll need you near the head table shortly." Sophie nodded quickly, her pulse racing. The two men exchanged a look, one sharp, one amused, before Christopher moved off to charm another cluster of executives. Alexander's voice dropped low, meant only for her. "Be careful with Vaughn. He has a reputation." Sophie swallowed, her nerves buzzing. "I wasn't, he just introduced himself." "I know." His gaze lingered on her a moment longer than necessary. "But I don't like the way he looks at you." Before she could reply, a colleague called Alexander's name from across the room. He straightened, mask of composure slipping back into place. Sophie stood frozen for a moment, her heart pounding. Between Christopher's smooth attention and Alexander's possessive warning, the gala's glittering air had grown thick with unspoken tension. The gala stretched on, the ballroom humming with laughter, champagne toasts, and the low swell of the string quartet. Sophie tried to blend in, greeting colleagues, smiling when required, but her thoughts kept circling back to Alexander. Every time she glimpsed him across the room, tall, poised, eyes scanning like a hawk, her breath tightened. Near midnight, when most of the crowd had settled into easy conversation, Alexander approached. He extended a hand, his expression unreadable but his eyes intense. "Dance with me." Her heart jumped. "Here, now?" He arched a brow. "Would you prefer I ask twice?" The room blurred as she placed her hand in his. His palm was warm, steady, guiding her onto the parquet floor. The quartet shifted seamlessly into a slower waltz, and suddenly Sophie was in his arms, his hand resting firmly at her back, pulling her close. "You look beautiful tonight," Alexander said softly, low enough that only she could hear. "Thank you," Sophie whispered, her voice trembling. "You clean up pretty well yourself." For the first time, his mouth curved into a real smile, small but devastating. "Pretty well? That's all?" She laughed, nerves dissolving into the warmth of his presence. But then the air shifted again. His hand tightened slightly at her back, his gaze locking onto hers with a seriousness that made her throat go dry. "Vaughn was out of line earlier," he said, his voice edged. "I don't like him near you." Sophie's pulse quickened. "He was just making conversation." "Men like Vaughn don't just converse," Alexander said, his tone clipped. Then softer. "I don't want anyone else looking at you the way I do." The confession hit her like a lightning strike. Heat flushed her chest, her skin buzzing under his touch. She couldn't look away. "And how do you look at me?" she whispered. For a moment, his composure wavered. He stopped moving, holding her still in the center of the floor while the music carried on around them. His hand slid from her back to her waist, pulling her closer. His eyes darkened, searching hers with a hunger he no longer tried to mask. Then he kissed her. It wasn't tentative. It was claiming, fierce, the culmination of every unspoken glance, every charged silence. Sophie's world tilted. The gala, the chandeliers, the music all vanishing until there was only his mouth on hers. The taste of champagne and heat, the press of his hand anchoring her against him. When he finally pulled back, her breath shuddered, her lips tingling. He looked at her as though he had crossed a line he could never retreat from. "This changes everything," Alexander said quietly. Sophie swallowed, her body trembling, her heart soaring and terrified all at once. She knew he was right. Nothing would ever be the same. The week after the gala felt like stepping into an entirely different life. On the surface, nothing had changed. Sophie still arrived at Harrington Tower at 8 sharp, still typed out meeting agendas, still scheduled calls and booked travel. Alexander Harrington remained the commanding CEO, his stride purposeful, his tone clipped and precise. To the rest of the firm, everything looked exactly the same. But beneath the polished routines, a new rhythm pulsed between them. A brush of his hand as he passed a folder. A glance held too long across the conference table. An email sent late at night with wording that was professional, but carried an undertone she could feel in her bones. Their worlds had tilted after that kiss, and though neither spoke of it directly, both moved through each day as if tethered by an invisible thread. There were stolen moments, too. One evening, Sophie lingered to finish a presentation when the office had emptied out. Alexander appeared silently at her desk, his jacket gone, sleeves rolled to his elbows. He leaned against her desk, close enough for her to catch the faint spice of his cologne. "You work too late," he murmured. "And whose schedule is that?" she teased softly, emboldened by the privacy. His lips quirked, but his eyes didn't waver. "I don't regret the gala," he said, his voice low, intimate. Not for a second, her chest tightened. She hadn't stopped thinking about that kiss either, how it had unraveled her, how it had felt both forbidden and inevitable. But in the office, restraint ruled. He never touched her when others could see. He never crossed the line where whispers might rise. And yet his presence filled every space she entered, his attention unmistakable even when no one else noticed. Olivia, of course, noticed. "Something's different with you," she said one afternoon over coffee. "You've got this, Miss Glow. Don't tell me Mr. Harrington is suddenly being nicer?" Sophie forced a laugh, brushing off the comment. But inside her pulse raced. She wanted to tell someone, to confide the storm raging between her and the man who should have been untouchable, but secrecy was their safety. Their meetings remained professional, their touches hidden, their words layered with double meaning. At night, though, when Sophie lay awake replaying the smallest details, the brush of his fingers, the weight of his gaze, she realized she was already in too deep, and she wasn't sure she wanted to climb back out. The annual leadership retreat had always been a mix of work and leisure. But for Sophie, this year's destination, Jackson Hole, Wyoming, felt like stepping into another world. The snow-dusted peaks loomed majestic against the sky, and the crisp mountain air carried pine and wood smoke. Executives gathered for strategy sessions by day and networking dinners by night. But Sophie's nerves had nothing to do with presentations or schedules. It was the first time she and Alexander had traveled together since the gala. She told herself it was just work, that she was there as his assistant, but the undercurrent between them was impossible to ignore. One evening, after a long day of meetings, Sophie found herself walking alone through the lodge's quiet hallway. She paused by the tall windows, gazing at the stars scattered across the dark mountain sky. She hadn't heard his footsteps, but she felt him before she saw him. "You should be resting," Alexander said softly from behind her. She turned, and there he was, tie loosened, jacket draped over his arm. The controlled precision of the CEO replaced by something more human, more raw. "I couldn't sleep," Sophie admitted. "Too much on my mind." He stepped closer, the air between them sparking alive. "Is it work keeping you up?" Her heart thudded. Not exactly. For a moment, neither moved. Then Alexander reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her cheek, his touch lingering just long enough to undo her composure. "I can't keep pretending, Sophie," he murmured. "Not out here. Not anymore." The restraint they had clung to snapped. His mouth captured hers with a hunger that had been simmering for weeks, and she melted into him, her arms looping around his neck as though she had always belonged there. His hands anchored her, strong and certain, pulling her closer as if the world itself might try to pry them apart. Later, in the privacy of his suite, the connection deepened. The fire crackled in the stone hearth, casting golden light across the room as they gave in fully. No walls, no titles, no rules. For the first time, Sophie felt the weight of secrecy lift, replaced by something fiercer, a bond that felt unshakable. When dawn broke over the mountains, painting the peaks in rose and gold, she lay beside him, breathless and undone, her head resting against his chest. He held her as though she were something fragile and precious, and in that quiet moment, Sophie knew with terrifying certainty, she wasn't just falling for him. She already had. Weeks turned into months, their secret weaving itself into the fabric of Sophie's life. The thrill of stolen moments never dulled, but so did the weight of what they risked, his reputation, her career, the whispers that might come if anyone discovered them. Yet every time Alexander looked at her, every time his hand found hers in the dark, Sophie felt steadier in the truth of what they shared. One quiet evening in Boston, after another long day at the office, Alexander called her into his study. His townhouse was bathed in soft lamplight, the city's hum muted by thick curtains. Sophie stepped inside, expecting work, perhaps another contract that couldn't wait, but instead she found something unexpected on his desk. It was a single photograph. Her breath caught. It was the photograph, the coral bikini selfie she had once wished she could erase from existence. Only now it was printed on fine paper, framed simply, the colors warm against the dark wood. Her gaze flew to his. "You kept it?" Alexander's expression was uncharacteristically unguarded. "That picture changed everything," he said quietly. The moment it appeared on my phone, my world shifted. I saw you, not just my assistant, but the woman who has lived in my mind every day since. Sophie's chest tightened, her throat thick with emotion. I was mortified when I sent it. He stepped closer, taking her hand. And I was captivated. Still am. Before she could speak, he reached into his pocket and drew out a small velvet box. The air between them seemed to still, heavy with anticipation. When he opened it, the diamond inside caught the lamplight, scattering brilliance across the room. "Sophie Bennett," Alexander said, his voice steady but his eyes searching hers. "Will you marry me?" The world tilted. Tears welled in Sophie's eyes as her heart pounded against her ribs. "Yes," she whispered, the word breaking free before doubt could touch it. "Yes." He slipped the ring onto her finger, his hand trembling just slightly for the first time since she had known him. Then he kissed her, soft and certain, sealing the promise with a tenderness that made her knees weak. The framed photo remained on the desk behind them, no longer a mistake, no longer a source of shame. It was their beginning, their reminder of how something so unintended could lead them exactly where they were meant to be. The summer sun spilled golden light across Newport, Rhode Island, turning the estate's sprawling lawns into a dreamscape of roses and silk-draped chairs. Guests in elegant attire gathered beneath the white canopy, murmuring with excitement as the quartet played softly in the background. Sophie Bennett stood just beyond the archway, her veil trailing behind her, her bouquet trembling slightly in her hands. The lace of her gown shimmered as she inhaled deeply, steadying herself. It felt surreal, this moment, the culmination of a journey that had started with a single accidental text. When the music swelled, she stepped forward. Her gaze locked immediately on Alexander Harrington, waiting at the altar in a perfectly tailored suit, his expression composed yet softened in a way only she had ever seen. His eyes found hers instantly, steady and sure, grounding her as though no one else existed in the crowd. Each step brought her closer, until finally she stood before him. The minister's words washed over her, but Sophie barely heard them. All she could feel was Alexander's hand enclosing hers, firm and certain, his thumb brushing her knuckles in quiet reassurance. When it was time for vows, Alexander surprised her. Instead of reciting the traditional lines, he pulled a small frame from the table beside them. Sophie's breath caught. It was the photo, the coral bikini picture, now carefully set in silver. A ripple of laughter swept through the guests, but Alexander's voice was solemn. "This," he said, holding it up, "was a mistake. Or at least that's what we thought. But without this moment, I wouldn't have found the courage to see Sophie for who she truly is. The woman who has become my heart, my partner, my future." From error came everything right. Tears blurred Sophie's vision, her heart swelling so full it ached. When it was her turn, her voice trembled, but her words were clear. "I thought that picture would ruin me. Instead, it gave me you, and that has been the greatest gift of my life." The minister declared them husband and wife, and when Alexander kissed her, the crowd erupted in applause. Sophie clung to him, her veil fluttering in the summer breeze, the scent of roses wrapping around them. Later, as they walked hand in hand down the aisle to the cheers of family and colleagues alike, Sophie glanced at the framed photo now resting with their rings and vows. What had begun as her most humiliating mistake had brought her to this perfect moment. And she knew, with absolute certainty, that it had never been a mistake at all.